This feels a bit like this birthday party where nobody comes, you know. This feels
Welcome, everyone. This is Daniel Paez. I'm the chair of the commission. We are starting our webinar in this moment, our first session of our annual meeting. At the moment, we have 27 participants and the number is growing. So we'll give few seconds for people finish joining, and we're going to start with a video. I can see more people every second starting. So we'll be started very soon.
International Federation of Surveyors. Juan Yi, bienvenue, bienvenidos. Welcome to the 2020 FIG Commission 7 annual meeting. I'm Daniel Paez, the chair of the commission. FIG Commission 7, Cadastre and Land Management, is a group of volunteers of the International Federation of Surveyors dedicated to promote solutions and discuss ideas to better land tenure and land administration systems around the world. This year, unfortunately, we had to cancel our FIG in-person Commission 7 meeting, which was going to be held in Switzerland. Of course, we know this is not the same as our traditional Commission 7 event, which is full of friendship. But we hope this event will allow us to continue our network, and hopefully with the new normality in 2021, we will be meeting in Melbourne, Australia. Commission 7 has done many interesting work. It's in this commission where concepts like fit for purpose or crowdsourcing for tenure security were developed. And today we're working in very interesting projects like GLTN framework for urban-rural land linkage to try to integrate better development in both rural and urban areas, and with the United Nations Commission for Economic Development in Europe and their working party for land administration, in where we are developing new principles or a revised version of their principles for involving the private sector in land administration services and infrastructure. Let me use the opportunity to thank those of you that pay a fee or made a donation to this annual meeting. All profits of the donation of the FIG Commission 7 online event will be donated to the FIG Foundation. In this, let me now let you hear from the president of the foundation what is the great work of this non-for-profit organization.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this year's Commission 7 annual meeting. My name is John Hohol. I'm president of the FIG Foundation. And I'd like to make a really big thank you for the generous donation by Commission 7 of the registration fees received for this meeting and given to the FIG Foundation. It is very much appreciated and very much needed. We will put it to good use. Thank you again. What is the FIG Foundation? The Foundation is an independent body under the International Federation of Surveyors, FIG. The Foundation was established for the purpose of raising funds to finance surveying education and development projects, and supporting young surveyors with the prime focus in developing countries and countries in transition in order to build a sustainable future. The Foundation is administered by the FIG office in Copenhagen and directed by a board of directors appointed by the FIG Council. Here are the current FIG Foundation Board of Directors. Two of the directors shown, Michael Berry and David Mitchell, are presenters during this meeting. Where did the donations go? To date, since its establishment in 2002, the FIG Foundation has donated a total of 165 grants to surveyors from 70 countries, which includes sponsoring 69 educational courses, meetings, and conferences. The foundation also aims to sponsor 3 to 5 young surveyors to the yearly FIG Working Week Congress, all from different continents. In total, 340,000 euros has been spent on grants in this period and distributed around the world. This shows the map showing the countries where the grantees have been that have received grants from the foundation, as well as on the right side, it shows a pie breakdown of the percentages in the different continental regions. As an example, Africa has received 32%, Europe 32%, and so on. This shows a listing of the 70 countries that have grantees that have received donations. FIG has several key grant programs, and we hold these annually. They are the FIG Foundation Academic Research Grant, the FIG Foundation PhD Scholarship, the FIG Commission Publication Author Support Grant, the Aubrey Barker FIG Foundation Course Development Grant, and the FIG Foundation Grant for Young Surveyors Educational and Training Activities. More information on all these grants and other programs that we offer are available on the FIG Foundation website. The address is at the end of my presentation. We also cooperate with other funded activities such as FIG Commission annual meetings, International Training Summer School, Young Surveyors meetings, the Volunteer Community Surveyor Program, which is an initiative of the UN and the Young Surveyors Network, and of course, the GLTN, the Global Land Tool Network, the Social Tenure Domain Model, STDM, and the Trainer of Trainers. And this is also a program that involves the Young Surveyors Network very much. The FIG Foundation in this year's Commission 7 annual meeting, I just decided to list some relationships. As an example, you can see some of the people that are participating in this year's annual meeting and their current relationship with the foundation. As an example, Mike Berry is a presenter and a current FIG Foundation Board Director. Chetna Ben from Fiji is a presenter and a past FIG grant recipient. Paula Dykstra, a presenter and past FIG grant recipient. John Pierre is a rapporteur and a past FIG grant recipient. David Mitchell, also a presenter and a current FIG Foundation Director. And Daniel Paez, the presenter, past FIG grant recipient, and the current chair of Commission 7. Also, Chrissy Poitso, honorary FIG president, past president of FIG, also a presenter and a past FIG Foundation Board Director. And Ava Maria Unger, a presenter and also a past FIG grant recipient. 15 years ago, I was very honored to be able to host the Commission 7 annual meeting, the 2005 annual meeting in Madison, Wisconsin. And this is kind of a way back photo showing the attendees at that meeting. In the middle is Paul Vandermolen, who is chair of Commission 7. And next to him is Stig Enemark, who is also a past president of FIG. And so it's a nice look back from 15 years ago. I wish you all a very successful annual meeting, and thank you very much. For more information about the FIG Foundation, please visit our newly updated website, which is fig.net/FIG Foundation. It has lots and lots of very valuable information, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I would like now to hand it over to Rohan Bennett, our chair for this session.
Well, a very good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, and a good night to all of you joining us around the globe to this first session of the 2020 Commission 7 AGM. I think we had a nice video introduction there from Daniel, the current chairperson of the Commission. And this is the first session of an 11-session program that's going to be running across the next 3 days. I just thought it was worth saying a thanks from the top, because I don't want to forget to do it, to Daniel and the secretary, Paula Dijkstra, from the FIG head office or secretariat in Denmark, with a particular thanks to Claudia, who've put in a lot of effort over the last few weeks to get the sessions up and running and get the coordination going. So thanks very much for that. I should introduce myself and the rapporteurs. Yes, so I'm Rohan Bennett, and I'm a geodetic advisor with Cadastre International, which is the Netherlands mapping, cadastral and spatial information agency, and I work in the international arm of that agency. And I'm acting today as the moderator for the session, and I'll explain shortly how the session is going to run. And alongside me is Dr. Kwabena Asiyama, who's our rapporteur for the session, and he is, and I always get this wrong, so feel free to correct me, Kwabena. He's the Young Surveyor Network's Deputy Chair. I hope that's the right title. And he's also an associate or assistant professor at Leibniz University in Hanover in Germany. So we'll be running the session. Of course, we've also got the chairperson of Commission 7, Daniel Paes, alongside us. So this first session is a real big picture look to get us introduced to or reintroduced to land administration and where we're at in 2020. It's got, we've compiled, I think, a really great lineup of speakers for this session. We're covering academia, we're covering some of the larger donor organisations, we're covering the small and medium enterprises, and we're also covering government. So we've got all the sectors really covered in our set of speakers. And even though this is nominally the Asia Pacific opening, and there'll be another, if you look at the program, there's another opening, some other openings this afternoon for the AGM. We're really still taking a global snapshot of activities in the session. So we've got topics covered taking a global perspective, but we've also got some sort of more narrowed in presentations. And the session will run in the following way. We will be giving each of the presenters 15 minutes to set the agenda, to put their topics on the table. And we'll also be able to take questions at the end of each of those sessions, short questions or clarifying remarks. And then at the end of that, we'll have a more traditional FIG panel type session and Q&A session. Now, this is all a bit new for us all, obviously. Normally we're all in the same room and we can sort of cut across each other and sort of get the debate going. So we're going to try and see how we can replicate that best in the online environment. So you can see down the bottom of your own screens, for those who are participating, you can see there's both the chat box, so you can indicate, you can say hello there if you like, but we'll take the formal questions using the Q&A box. And Corbetta and I will be monitoring those, and the speakers, if there's shorter questions, we'll be able to respond to those as well. So I think that's all the housekeeping we need to cover off. I'm just going to get a nod from Daniel to make sure I haven't missed anything there. No, he's giving me the go-ahead. So then I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Keith Bell, who is an Australian national, but has has been with the World Bank and its various land activities since 2003. And I should say for all our speakers, they really are all thought leaders in their various positions they held and have done so for multiple decades. Keith himself has worked globally in leading and advising programs on land, national spatial data infrastructures, and has had a particular focus at times on resilience and disaster response. He led and has led the World Bank's land-related programs in East Asia and the Pacific region until 2017. He's also a chartered professional engineer and licensed surveyor, so very apt for our professional group here. And he's worked in more than 35 countries, and many of those in various stages of conflict or post-conflict and fragility. Prior to World Bank, he had a completely different life where he spent 20 years in the Australian public sector, and he was a Surveyor General in multiple states, which is quite an impressive feat. And he was also, and perhaps most recently, and perhaps most known to us, the co-author of the flagship Fit for Purpose Land Administration publication in 2013. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Bell, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ron. With an introduction like that, I hope I don't disappoint. I feel like a crash test dummy. My screen has just gone off, so I have to do this again. So my apologies. And here we go. So hopefully the communications work well. I'm going to skip through these slides. Some of them I've actually included more for completion purposes. I'm trying to, during the course of my presentation, reflect over the past 30 years of the World Bank, which goes back before my time and includes my period of time here, as well as bring it up to the current time and with what we might be foreseeing in the future post-COVID. The opinions in this presentation are really my own. As all these presentations are. And I'd like to emphasize the point that at times, we've got to avoid groupthink. And as if I can quote a general pattern, if everyone's thinking like, somebody isn't thinking. And of course, Benjamin Franklin said something similar to that about 200 years earlier than that. Let me skip through this. This is mainly just for corporate inclusion.
We cannot see your slides yet.
You can't see them?
Yes, we cannot see it. If you want to share them again.
Okay, let me go back. This is one of the technology problems. I was sharing the screen. Is that sharing?
Not yet.
This is annoying. Try again.
Perfect. We can see them.
That's okay?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, please interrupt. Okay, you heard me anyway, so I won't go through those things again. Just in terms of the World Bank, about 11,000 employees. Currently, there's about an annual $60 billion in financing of projects across all spectrums. The World Bank has two particular objectives: extreme poverty elimination and promoting shared prosperity. Now, turning to what I really want to quickly cover, and I'm going to talk fairly quickly, is things have changed a lot over the last 30 plus years. Back in the 1980s, and there's no one from the 1980s involved in World Bank land projects still around in the World Bank. They've all obviously retired. Those days, during that decade, it is a full decade, there was $150 million in World Bank financing. There may have been other financing from World Bank projects from the governments themselves and donor partners, but there were only 3 projects covering 3 countries. By 1996, this had expanded to about $550 million, covering 13 projects in 13 countries. At that time, that represented only about 1% of the World Bank annual financing portfolio. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of what lending for World Bank supported land projects was about. Individual projects ranged between about $30 and $120 million. By 2020, so this was just this year, over the previous 6 years, there was around $2 billion in lending for land-related projects. The exact number of projects I'm not sure of. That seems to be a moving feast depending how projects were categorized. But significantly, the lending on those projects ranged between about 20 and the biggest was $370 million. The significant point in all of this is that the big thing that spurred land projects alone was the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And so the biggest portfolio of land projects was in Europe and Central Asia. Significantly, land projects, in the early days were more focused on systematic land registration, which is primarily about regulation of rights. There's usually some policy work, some institutional development, and some capacity building. In the early days, there was some work that commenced on property valuation, a bit of mapping, and a bit of work on geodesy. Of course, by 2000, what we saw was a huge amount of digitalization of land registry systems, services, and data. And I mean, I think that just stands to reason. If you reflect back on, one of the most successful World Bank projects, which was the Thailand one, there was no digitalization that took place in those days. So that was something that started in the late 80s and went through to 2003. That was actually the first project I was involved in with the World Bank. Since then, we've seen massive investments in NSDI-related matters, including cores, fundamental data sets. We've seen work on land concessions, private sector development, and so forth. In my case, starting in early 2005, moved into disaster response with Aceh, and then moving on to things like Haiti and the experiences of Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. Since around 2016, resilience has become a very important theme, and I'll touch on that later. It's particularly relevant given COVID. Significantly, and some of these thoughts that I'm using here actually come from an excellent paper that was prepared by colleague, long-retired Lynn Holstein in 1996. I've included the reference at the bottom of the screen. Our projects tended to stay away from forestry areas, indigenous peoples. Typical projects were 4 or 5 components, usually one implementing agency. This tended to migrate into the promotion of the single land agency model, land registration and Cadastre together, which I haven't always agreed with given my past experiences in government. In East Asia Pacific, where I started, we always had a strong technical assistance program, usually funded by Australia, and I'm in cadres with the firm that was typically leading the TA, which was Land Equity International. One of the things we saw was in the early days, not much on social and gender, and I could say much more about that, but I'd need 2 hours, but it emerged over time. We had very much over-engineered surveying accuracies, probably driven by vested interests, and that's primarily what led to the FIG Fit for Purpose publication. That Stig raised with me many, many years ago. A lot of governance challenges and rent seeking took place in all of the countries, and they still do. And I think that's a major issue for COVID. One of the things I think that was very unfair in all of those days was these comparisons of unit costs, $1 in one country for titling and $50 in another country. It was a completely stupid argument because it failed to consider local costs of living, labor costs, and all that sort of stuff. And I think it just was ridiculous. I don't think the urban and rural issues were particularly well considered in the early days. And of course, spatial planning never really came into it. So regularizing lands that hadn't been properly planned, I think, was a fundamental issue. So moving on to some of the concerns from those days, around about 2000, the famous Hernando de Soto published The Mystery of Capital, which was all about, revealing your wealth from property ownership and using it to mortgage and invest in things like that. I think what we've seen now with the GFC of 2008, that's the global financial crisis, now the pandemic, is people going to the wall and losing because they've actually over-relied on collateralization. Just today, I'm actually doing this presentation from Phuket in northern Thailand. What I'm shocked about is how COVID has turned the place into a ghost town. People have gone to the wall because of tourism falling apart. Suicides are on the rise in Thailand, 22% increase this year, all because of the pandemic and financial issues. Another particular concern that I had from early work in the bank was the premise that titled land was more valuable than untitled land. One of the things I learned early in the piece is that wasn't particularly true. I remember some work that was presented to me in the Philippines on the province of Bohol, where it was claimed that titled land was more valuable. What it actually turned out was a huge South Korean investment there had increased the demand for land, so development and tourism were the key things that drove up property prices, not having titles. One thing that's I'd just like to note, which probably a lot of people have seen, is the World Bank's Doing Business, which covers 12 areas, has been suspended. It's often been used by a lot of people in the World Bank, in my team, to promote the success of land projects. It's interesting that it's been used as a proxy. Unfortunately, it's not really a valid proxy in my view, because it doesn't cover mainstream property. It covers industrial, commercial property, factory, warehouse, no mortgages and things like that. So I would use it, and I always tell people to use Doing Business with due caution. One of the things, I use this term zombie statistic, which was a term coined by a colleague, Malcolm Childress. We hear a lot about this thing of 70% of the world's population not having access to land administration services. It's often construed as something else. That's a statistic that was basically a guesstimate from Willie Zimmerman, who was doing some work from FAO. It doesn't actually have a solid analytical base. It's disappointing when I see it frequently used, including by FIG at the working week last year. And it was basically used to set a performance indicator for FIG in terms of growing ownership. So I think that needs to be with caution. I know even some of my fellow speakers have used this statistic or one of its many false equivalences, but it is false. It doesn't have a thorough analytical basis. I welcome that we have Prindex coming along. Later during the FIG session, we are going to see Malcolm Childress present on Prindex. It's quite surprising. It's based on some pretty solid work using the Gallup poll method, covers 140 countries, 168,000 people surveyed. It's about perception though. But one of the interesting things from the global perspective, from the statistic here that Malcolm has shared with me, is 1 in 5 adults feel they perceive insecure about their property rights. One of the things I would like to see at some stage is some thorough work actually done with national censuses. Over the last 30 years, the World Bank has had some very significant partnerships. One is which is with FIG, which is something I put together with Stig way back in 2007, and I'm particularly proud of that. We have other ones, of course, with the FAO, which is very long-standing, and so forth. Something that's particularly important in this time of COVID, so I'm moving into the present thing, is that things are changing very significantly. The World Bank president just announced $12 billion package of support for COVID to do with vaccines and stuff. There's very significant financing, which is to help countries, particularly low-income countries, handle the pandemic, and there's $160 billion set aside for that. World Bank will be providing a lot of financial and technical support over the coming years as well. Funding priorities for the World Bank in the COVID time is resilience, and I believe that land and geospatial will fit into here. It's pretty uncertain at this particular point in time. Economic connectivity is the second priority, and it really relates to things like trade and business activities, financial relationships, and state-sponsored economic relations. And finally, human capital, which covers health and education. So you can see that the old days of priorities for the World Bank, which were basically on a very much a sector thematic basis, are now gone. It is a new world. So that's something to be aware of. Build Back Better is something which hasn't been too much used by the World Bank. I mean, I know it's being used by the Biden campaign in the United States, but I think there's great opportunities being presented now with COVID to see that the world can change and can get back better. particularly when it comes to environmental matters. I'm particularly proud of the Build Back Better theme because it's something that actually came out of our work in Arche back in 2005. It's not quite correctly reported on Wikipedia, where it says it came out of the Sendai Agreement, but it was actually something that was dreamed up in our work with President Bill Clinton. So I'm getting towards the end of my presentation now, as I see Rowan's pensive face. Some of the challenges in returning to normal, that is, when will normality actually resume, and will it be normal? We're starting to see virtual supervision of all projects across the bank. I mean, I did a couple of virtual supervision missions in the last couple of months. Will that continue? Will it move into third-party supervision, as we see in a lot of conflict countries? There's problems in not being there, and you do need a hands-on role, because not having that direct relationship and seeing things face-to-face does lead, I think, to challenges of governance and so forth. Land and geospatial investment should focus on resilience. That's really what we're doing. I think it's the idea of the DeSoto stuff is long gone. As I've mentioned, as part of Build Back Better, there are lots of opportunities to address climate change and other environmental changes in the land and geospatial sectors. We need to watch out for rent seeking. There's going to be a lot of legacies of the pandemic period that we need to be wary of. I think there's opportunities to restructure the Sustainable Development Goals. Many experts, including the UN Special Rapporteur, have confirmed that they were poorly put together, poorly designed, with a lot of bad indicators. And I think we see that with 1.4.2. I think FIG has a great role to play in there in bringing some oversight to all of this. So on all those happy notes, and I think I've just done it in 15.5 minutes, I hand back to Rowan. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thanks so much, Keith. That was a really lightning introduction, I think, to the history, the current, and even a little bit of the future context for which the world of land administration, land management, and cadastre has to play within. In many respects, you've sort of put some sobering points on the table, but also finishing there, I think, with some areas for opportunity that we can unpack. And it's good that you've obviously touched on already the impacts going on within the bank from COVID-19 situation. And I think we're going to see in some of the other presentations too, how that's accelerated in many senses, this move towards digital transformation and working at distance. So thank you very much really for setting the scene for us. We did envisage that there would be the chance to offer or ask questions from the floor, and we did plan to use the Q&A, but that seems like that's given way to the chat box. So it looks like chat box is winning, and I'm just going to pick off and it's quite useful there. Is there questions for Keith? And I'm already going to jump straight into Brent Jones. I guess I don't need to throw for him because he's actually put his question there. So Brent Jones is from Esri, based in the US, and he's going to be presenting later in the week, but he's got the question for you, Keith. Can you just expand a little bit on your post-Hernando comment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, again, the Hernando de Soto thing was that by people having secure property rights, they'd basically take out mortgages or other financing based on those property rights. And what we've actually seen is that's not valid. We've seen just in the last month of September in the United States, 6 million owners of property with secure rights not able to pay mortgages. They're going to be evicted. What we've seen in countries around the world, including Australia, Thailand, we've seen huge, people, basically facing evictions on property. We have suicides, on the rise. The validity of continuing in promoting collateralization as a primary reason for doing land titling is not valid. There are other reasons. Those reasons include social order, reduction in conflict, and so forth. Stability of communities, having control over planning and so forth. So I mean, I think the De Soto thing was great at the time. It was used by President Clinton when I worked at Arche all the time as the reason to promote property, but it really has been proven to be no longer valid. And we look at the other fundamental reasons which are more social for securing property rights. And that doesn't mean titling too, because we need to look at customary lands, the rights of people in forests and so forth. Back to you, Ron.
Could I make a comment there?
Of course, Mike.
Okay, the De Soto theory goes back to the mid-1840s, I think, and it's been tried with limited success in certain instances. Simple thing with any theory like that is you've got to look, there's certain conditions under which it holds. Okay, anything, or critical success factors, and Keith's alluded to some of them. You're going to examine that, and if they're not there, you either create them or you don't, or you look at an alternative. But one doesn't just charge in with a simple theory and say this is going to have outcome X, because that's not going to happen.
Thanks, Mike. And it's good that the world doesn't have too many examples of that happening in practice.
Can I respond just quickly to that, Ryan?
If you can keep it to 20 seconds.
Okay, I fully agree with Mike too. And I think that goes to the heart of a lot of the issues that we have with all our land work, where we focus on correlation rather than causality. You know, we don't look at the bigger picture and all the various factors that come into play. We pick one or two things and we think because something's working, it's great. You know, it's like people have got title land, values have gone up. We don't look at all the other factors and so forth. So Mike is absolutely 100% correct.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's move on to our next presenters, and this one presents more of a technical challenge for me because I got to click through multiple slide decks.
We have questions in the Q&A for Keith very quickly. Which countries are the top of priorities of the World Bank concerning land administration? What's your view on that, Keith? What are the current top priorities?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, the biggest lending of any project that's ever happened in World Bank history happened in June this year in the Philippines as part of agrarian reform, $370 million. But what we're actually starting to see now is programs emerging in both East and West Africa. Africa's been broken into two regions. So I would say most of the work, the new priorities will be in the African region over the coming decade or so.
Okay. Can you hear me, Daniel? Okay, I just wanted to check. Let's move on to our next presenter this afternoon or this evening. And this is something from a different perspective again, and it's probably one of the more positive stories, I think, for 2020, but let's see how the debate goes on that. We've got two presenters for this next presentation, and they're both in some ways representing the UN-GGIM, but also they're both from Cadastre International, so it's a dual presentation. The first part of the team, and I should probably do it in a gender sensitive order, is Dr. Eva Maria Unger, who is a senior geodetic advisor with Cadastre International and has been so for several years, and was also the Young Surveyor Network, as you saw in John Hohol's presentation, was the chair, I think, is that the correct word, chair? Or has it got another name? Yep, chair back in the previous round or iteration of that. And our other speaker is Kees de Zeeuw, who's the director of Cadastre International, which is the Netherlands Cadastre Land Registry and Mapping Agency, and has been the UN-GGIM chair on the group of experts for land administration and management. So obviously some crossovers between the FIG Commission we're sitting within and UN-GGIM. And he's been active in FIG obviously for many years since his role in as the director of Cadastre International. So they're going to present this morning, and I won't steal the thunder too much here, on this framework for effective land administration. And I think it is my job, if you could just confirm, Kees, that you'd like me to drive the slides.
Yes, you'll drive the slides.
I will get those up.
And the good thing is I can see if the slides are there because you're doing it. So that's the advantage. Okay, thank you very much, Rowan. Good day or good night to everybody. It's a pleasure to see some of you and to see the name of some of you, because it has been a long time since we've met, since we've seen. So it's good to be in a joint session again in this Commission 7. I just want to give you a very short introduction to the framework for effective land administration and management. It's a job which has been done during the last few years in the context of UN-GGIM. And in the next slide, Rowan, I would like to go just in a few minutes with you through the process that we have been going through. So I assume that most of you know what UN-GGIM is, but at least I will spend one slide on it, or two slides, that you realize what we're talking about. I will tell a little bit about the process, how we came to the development of our framework, and finally about the adoption of the framework by the committee of experts. So it's a very short introduction. Eva Maria will really take you a little bit deeper into the framework itself. It's, I think, as a start, very important to tell you that the framework is not something new. It's not containing a new methodology or something like that. The framework is the language that the United Nations like to talk to each other if they talk about land administration. And I think it's a very good document that helps us in promoting in the world, and in the world of UN-GGIM or the UN in general, to promote the need for effective land administration and management in the world. So don't consider this as a new kind of LADM or a new kind of fit for purpose approach. It's just the framework that is needed within the UN. So in the next slide, you'll see just explained in one slide what UN-GGIM is. It's the United Nations context. It's where the worlds of statistics and mapping came together. And in the end, remote sensing and land administration have become an essential part of it as well. I think that the IT people will say that they are part of it as well, but consider the information technology as a kind of a source over this total. But I think this image is reflecting very much what UN-GGIM is about. In the next slide, you can see that UN-GGIM is organized in all kinds of structures. Of course, it's UN, so they have difficult language and they have difficult structures. That's why they are UN. And I'm not going to explain it full to you, but apart from the regional committees that they have, so they have for the different continents, they have regional organizations. They also have expert groups and working groups. And land administration is the theme of one of the expert groups. In the next slide, you can see that the expert group is containing different countries. Those are the member states of the UN that have indicated that they want to participate in this specific theme. And you see professional organizations that are really want to support the member states in doing this work. At this moment, the expert group is led by the Netherlands and by Guyana. So there are 2 co-chairs for the group. And we have, I didn't count them correctly, but I think we have a little bit more than 30 members participating in the group. This group worked for the last few years. In the next slide, you can see that, on developing this framework for effective land administration. And to do so, of course, there were a lot of people writing things, but at the same thing, there were a lot of people involved from the world in doing reviews of what's happening. And what you can see that we went through 2 rounds of review. One is the internal review round that we did within the expert group. And you can see it on the left. There were a lot of comments on text that were reprocessed. And once we had a document from the expert group, we said, okay, we're going to present these to all the member states of the UN. We went into the second review process. You see that at the right. And again, there were 266, were a lot of individual comments that we all processed to come to a document that is agreed on by all the member states in that sense. And I think that's a very essential part of the process. That's a kind of an agreement document. And of course, if you come to agreed document, there is always reason to disagree with the document by anyone. But on the other hand, the force of the power of the document is that it's a UN document. So all the member states have committed to it, that at least this is a good starting point if we talk about effective land administration. And if I go to the next slide, then you see in the end we came up with a document. So it's there. And the last slide of my introduction shows that, and that's the good news. And I think we did a lot of hard work to get there. But in the last show, you see that in August this year, the UN-GGIM, the Committee of Experts of UN-GGIM, they adopted the framework. One more slide, Rowan, I think. Yeah. And in UN language, then you have decisions with difficult numbers. And one of the decisions was on the land administration. And I only took out the red part that you see that the framework has been welcomed and adopted by the members of UN-GGIM. It's a living document. There is always room to change and to improve. And the first step now will be to make it in various languages of the UN available. For the content of the framework, I give the floor now to Eva Maria Ungar. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think, Rowan, you're going to start my slides, please. So also good morning, evening, afternoon, or good night from this side of the world. So thanks, Kes. I will go a little bit more into the overall content, but first I want to dive more into the development process, if I'm getting my slides. Otherwise, I can also try to share, but I think it's best. Okay, I think I'm just going to start without the slides. So as Kees was mentioning, the UN-GGIM Expert Group on Land Administration was established in 2015. So this was also the time, although there were a lot of negotiation processes before, but the SDGs were there in 2015. And what really gave a push, oh, thank you, Rowan. Now I just need, exactly. So I included your name as well, Rowan, because you were also a big part of this framework. Next slide, please. Yes, so I already said 2015, the establishment of the UN-GGIM Expert Group on Land Administration, and then in 2016 was the Addis Ababa Declaration. Next slide, please. And what you can see in this Addis Ababa Declaration is it was really highlighting the importance of land administration as being more increasingly recognized and emphasized. And in this Addis Ababa Declaration, I also copied a little bit of the declaration in the slide. It confirms that up-to-date information that is consistently available and accessible over space and time underpins good land administration and management, and basically leading to good land governance and sustainable development. Next slide, please. The Delft meeting then in 2017, exactly. The Delft meeting in 2017 then was really the starting point of the development of the FELA, and in 2018, UN-GGIM really encouraged the expert group to formulate this overarching policy guidance that could be referenced by all the member states. And it was basically, I would say, 3 years' time from now that we are there with this document. And Kees, you saw the consultation process, so it was really thoroughly consolidated over those years. Next slide, please. So probably for land administration professionals who have not been directly involved in the development process, it could be that FELA might appear to be just another UN document, but we all think that this risks underplaying the opportunities we have there as land professionals to have a fully endorsed UN framework which we can work with and which we can also basically use in negotiation processes. And what really makes FELA strong is that it makes the explicit connection to the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the domain of the land administration. And you can see the graphic on the right-hand side. It harmoniously combines these important previously established global policies, tools, and frameworks, which were generated and developed by all these global donor organizations, but also by leading NGOs. And it brings this all together. And what is also really important is that the core of FELA is built around those integrated nature of the SDGs and its 5 Ps. So people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And these 5 Ps demand effective land administration, which is realized through integrated geospatial information for land policies, land tenure, land value, land use, and land development. Within the document itself, you can then read more in depth on how those 5 Ps are addressed and supported by effective land administration. I'm not going into this level of detail. But when you read through the document, and then you see also the mission and the vision of the FELA, and there comes also the definition of effective land administration, which you see in the slide on the left-hand side. And Keith, because you were mentioning the importance of resilience when we are talking about land administration and geospatial information, we included this resilience perspective also in this definition of effective land administration. So you can see it partly covered there so that all the member states could agree upon. Next slide, please. So exactly, you can also see here all the pathways and the goals and the requirements. So FELA with its 9 strategic pathway aims to provide this framework that basically puts the member states into the driving seat when it comes to establish or strengthen, coordinate, or monitor the land administration systems at national or subnational level. So the overall nature, next slide please, Rowan, of FELA is also that it aligns to the overarching IGIF, the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, and implements the IGIF for the land sector. So you will see a lot of similarities, and I will explain those similarities a little bit more in detail and how this link was established. Nevertheless, FELA is a really strategic and high-level framework at this current stage as it is, and it tries to enable the professional domain to communicate the need for effective land administration at all the different levels. So the framework starts with a really a description of all the background work which was done by all the previous tools which were established. And I think Kees was mentioning this before, FELA is nothing new. It is really bringing all those tools and guidelines and organizations and member states together. So I think this is the nature of FELA. Next slide, please. Exactly. So we have all those 9 different pathways, which I didn't mention now, but you can read them, and they are the same as for the IGIF with just slightly differences, because, for example, within the GGIM meeting in China, accountability was included in one of the pathways, as this is a real guiding principle within the land administration domain. So nevertheless, so there is a detailed description of the pathways in the document, and those pathways, they provide a compass for actually implementing FELA. So each of the pathways can be considered in a standalone fashion or within groups. The implementation, nevertheless, that will really vary from country to country and is based on the national priorities, but also on the national context. So it's suggested that FELA is a living document and that it can be incrementally updated over time, as we all know knowledge and also especially innovation is entering the land administration domain in really high speed. So in principle, the pathway is following this structure. So the first part is always linking to the SDGs. So I will later have one example, the data example. And then there is another part which is establishing the link to the IGF, to the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. And then it describes what it actually means for FELA, what it actually means for effective land administration. So I included one example. Next slide, please, Rowan. The pathway on FELA, for example, you see again how it is really built upon, and you see that, I mean, there are some general statements like data cuts across all the SDGs, and that it's describing the build and the natural environments, and that this ICT and web technologies is bringing this data to life and also enables us to address those indicators and those goals which are defined within the SDGs. Then we have the link to the IGIF, and this is then going into more detail. How is this linked? How is the data theme of FELA linked to IGIF? And within UN-GGIM, there are the fundamental data themes. They are defined. They have been adopted as well. And you see like the cross-sector multidisciplinary collaboration when it is about data. And then there is interoperability coming in to be able to share this data amongst different organizations. Next slide, please. And then within, it goes into what it actually means for effective land administration when we look at data, and then we really have the data we do have in land administration is defining on the how, the what, the who, the when, and the where of land tenure, land use, land value, and land development. And it's again highlighting this integratable nature of other data. And then it is about the custodianship, but also about the standardization when we are talking about interoperability. And of course, then there's LADM, but there's also IHO with the S121 on the maritime limits and boundaries. Next slide, please. Just to bring some examples that you see what is included in the FELA and how it is built upon. Yeah. So it also links, of course, when it is about data to the spatial data infrastructure, which is still big issues there. And then the transaction processes. So I think you now do really understand how it is built and what is included. And I would recommend you to read the document. I included as well the link at the last slide. Next slide, please, Rowan. So FELA is there now, and it has been adopted via UN-GGIM, but I think, and this is a premiere because this is the first time that we are presenting FELA as an adopted framework. There is still a lot of work to be done. And an adoption of a document is just a starting point, but it depends on all these land professionals, and I think we have now 37 participants here, so we can say at least 37 people know now what FELA is about, and a little bit, and can have a more in-depth read. But it is about like what are the next step of FELA? What can we do as a land administration professionals? And I just listed 2 things here. So communication, educational, and awareness campaigns are definitely needed. The UN-GGIM and the expert group is currently working on the translation of FELA so that it's also available in Spanish and in French and in other languages, so that it can really bring to national levels, but also executive level, but also into the education, educational purposes. What can we do as land professionals is really that this national and state land administration, as well as donor organization, that they have the opportunity to reference themselves to FELA and to really incorporate the FELA and the pathways in their projects, for example, to find out, okay, where we are at in this specific pathway. FELA, and these are the next steps which are also included in the document itself, FELA will leverage on the IGF implementation guide and will use the IGF implementation guide as a reference resource. But again, and I think I'm running out of time, sorry, Ron, in order to achieve FELA and in order to really have this 2030 agenda core themes to leave no one behind and to transform our world through collaboration and partnership, we really need to support now by everybody, and that's why I included the link here. Please have a read there. Give us your ideas on what can be the next step. I think Kees, as one of the co-chairs, is happy to receive any suggestions. And yeah, thank you for your participation.
And thank you very much, Kees and Ava, for giving us this introduction to the framework for effective land administration for FELA. And I know for you both, it's past. You're now into Tuesday. So really, thanks so much for staying up to present this to us. It is a significant achievement. We know there's lots of land administration documents and ideas and philosophies around there, but this is actually one that's made it through the UN procedure to be endorsed. So I don't think we should underplay the significance of the work and effort put into that. We are sort of coming up to the top of the first hour, so I'm a bit conscious on time. We have some slack built into the program, which is all good. I did just want to remind all people taking part in the session that we are recording this, and the recordings and the slides where the presenters have approved will be made available to you, not immediately, but once the recordings are filtered and look through, they'll be made available. I'm just struggling a bit with my screen here, so I've stopped the sharing and I'm hoping we're back in the room now. Corbena, did we have any questions pop up during the session? And if not, I will ask whether there's anyone who'd like to ask a quick clarifying question or remark. Got one from one of the panelists, Keith. So just keeping the dialogue going amongst the panelists.
Yep. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for the presentation, guys. A double barrel question, but very briefly. First part is UN-GGIM the right organisation to be dealing with FELA, which UN-GGIM doesn't have a mandate for land administration. It's geospatial. And I look at the people participating at UN-GGIM meetings. They represent national mapping agencies, etc. I don't think it's right that they should be getting into land administration. And it's certainly one of the issues that we came across very early in the days of World Bank land administration projects, the conflicts between two different agendas. Second question is the approach of moving down templates. Over the last decade or so, we've seen templates for LGAF. We've seen things for IGIF being developed. We've seen now in the World Bank developing a template for PPP. Now we have FELA. You know, there's a thing called experience and expertise versus following templates. I've seen the work on IGIF. It really hasn't gone that far at this point in time. We see two countries now wishing to pursue it, Tonga and Mongolia. But there's a lot of ticking and whatever. With the FAO, we've done a lot of rapid assessment type approaches, which we've actually found to be a lot more effective now than doing template type approaches. Having said that, I think the template systems do provide a lot of good principles to refer to. Back to you.
Thanks, Keith. Kees?
Yeah, well, I'll respond to the first question and maybe Ava responds to the second question. First question is very easy. I could pose you another question. Within UN, where is land administration for the member states then, if it's not within UN-GGIM? There isn't. So I think you can be very critical on where we put it. On the other hand, we put it in the agenda and it wasn't there before at UN level for the member states. So maybe in content you're all right, but there is no alternative, I think. So in that sense, I think we tried to connect it to at least to the geospatial world. And I think that was the best option. Maybe we could find within the committee of experts or within the member states of the UN. So I'm not talking about UN organizations, but about the member states. And I think then this is the best place you can do. And otherwise the alternative was doing nothing. That was the alternative. So that's the first question. Second question I had to Ava.
Yeah, and thanks, Keith, for your question. I partly agree, and yes, this rapid assessment probably will bring more output, and if you compare like time and advice, what we found, and basically what you see in the land administration domain, you really like have a lot of in silo developments of tools and guidelines and everything, and what I think what FELA is bringing now is bringing those together, and if I'm sure you had a read already, and you see referenced all those tools and guidelines. So it's not bringing in a new assessment tool or whatever, if it's referencing to what is already there and how it can be used. So, and I think this is really the key. And it's not competing with any organization or competing with any tool developments or something. And yeah, so I hope this is answering a little bit your question.
Thanks, Ava. I'm not seeing a hand up from Keith. I guess the the real proof in the pudding of all these kind of frameworks, tools, templates, whatever you want to call them, is how they're used and when they're used and the uptake on them, and that'll be the real decider, I think, for FELA. We look back in a few years' time, and is how it was taken up. What was its impact? Okay, thank you very much, Case and Ava. And I also wanted to thank Keith, who has also risen very, very early to give the first presentation. I didn't mention that. So this is one of the drawbacks I think we're experiencing about this online approach and having these webinars, is that we all need lots of coffee or whiskey, depending on what end of the day you're at. Let's move to our next presenter, who is, I think, very well known to FIG and has been over a long period of time. And that's Dr. or Professor Michael Barry, who's originally from Cape Town, South Africa. And for the better part of this millennium has been with Calgary's Department of Geomatics in holding the chair in land tenure and cadastral systems. He has served the South African government in different boards relating to cadastral surveying, land tenure, registration systems, and GIS. And he's also extensively consulted, as we know, with the UN through FAO, UN Habitat, and various other donor agencies, including the World Bank, and extensive experience across Africa and Asia. He is also Canada's representative and has for a long time been their representative to Commission 7. And we're going to come down from the lofty global discussions we've been having to a more targeted or a specific case study focus here in Michael's presentation, but it also feeds into, I think, a broader discussion around land governance and the way that we are going to see that done into the future. So over to you, Michael.
Okay. Hi, okay. Let me try and share my screen quickly. Hello, everybody, somewhere, sometime. I hope it's good. I'm going down to the micro level. I'm going to use Monmouth BC Park informal settlement. Brief, in my 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about hybrid governance and evolutionary tenure records development, and also a bit about organizational culture. Okay, Monmouth BC Park is a community record system, and it's the only one that I've come across that is working in digital form. And it's done through open-ended evolutionary design. Sidestepped ISO standards. They didn't bother about voluntary guidelines or LADM. They did what was done in terms of the problem in front of them, and we can explain that in terms of organizational culture. It's also a participatory planning project in an informal settlement that is working, but of course there are questions around it. And it also looks at the notion of hybrid governance, and there's a distinctive mix of organizational cultures. Your political one, which is people who drive the invasion and then organize it, what we would call adhocracy. I'm not sure if you can see that slide. Can you see the full slide, Rowan? Or is it being cut off? Mine is being cut off. So you can see adhocracy there in the slide on the right-hand side. No. Okay, so I'm going to go back. Oh, blast. Okay, let's see what I can do.
We can see.
Okay.
I think we could see it all.
I'll work on this system. That should do it. Keith said he couldn't. So, Keith, can you see it now? the term adhocracy. Okay, I'll work with this. So I've got a research program that goes back to the 1990s when I joined academia. And I first came across it as a student when I grew up in South Africa under the apartheid system, which was racial segregation, which stopped Black South Africans moving into the cities. But that happened anyway. And we went as students into a shanty town and said, how do you document land rights? In the late 1970s, and you come up with the decision that you need to do it through aerial surveys. But how? And some of my profs tried model helicopters, which somebody flew into a wall, so that was the end of it. And people were using kites and all sorts of things. So it goes back a long way in terms of what is now fairly easy stuff to do. So I'm going to talk about hybrid governance. In the 1990s, I was on a land registration and land surveying options for the new South Africa when it became fully democratic. There was the land title evangelism where people were pushing what then became DeSoto, known as DeSoto's theory later, but it was around economic determinism, saying, get titles that'll let people invest and they'll get collateral. But there was a lot of evidence to say that it wasn't going to work. And a lot of my researchers said, yeah, that's a lot of people are not registering secondary transactions. So instead of creating a land market, you freeze it because formal financial institutions won't touch it. And so I looked at things like the talking titler software. I'll get through that. And then what makes a land tenure information system effective? Land tenure information system registration would be one of them. And how do we make registered titles work if that's the route you go? So South Africa's delivered something like 4.3 million houses, state subsidized since 1994. In that form, it's the largest titling program that I know of. And most of those homes are held as land titles. But titles mean different things to policymakers and beneficiaries. So that's the basis of my research. One of the first projects we worked on was an informal settlement place called Marconi Beam. One of my colleagues developed a sophisticated GIS for this, and it was supposed to be upgraded, and community leadership was supposed to stop influx. That didn't work. What did work in terms of keeping it up to date was something like that, a local notebook where I walked in and took photographs of it because people get threatened and the system is out of date as soon as you started it. We also had a whole lot, at the time, we had a whole lot of recommendations on what should happen on working groups. With national government, you need general boundaries, you need this local registration systems. So I went out and interviewed people and used models in the street and said, what happens if somebody builds over your boundary? There's some surprising results that come out of that. What happens if somebody knocks on the door and says this land isn't yours? Okay, you don't ask it in those terms because you'd better have very good running shoes. I worked in gangland for several years when I worked for the city of Cape Town. You had to know whose turf you were on and how to negotiate your way in. But that was the crux of the question. How do you defend your tenure? How do you secure transactions in land? Do you know of people being evicted? And those are the type of questions that you ask. So what are the social processes that are there rather than just this piece of paper? So we developed an information system in a rural case study where we used videos plus all the normal stuff you'd get in a paper-based system. And what happened? Well, the NGO was go, go, go. We'd do it. I did a whole lot of survey work for it as a land surveyor. And the NGO lost the records. They didn't give it to the community and it all fell apart. But that was the start of what I call the talking titler system. You'll see the data model similar to the LADM. There's some differences. And so what we looked at here was, what are the media items? We tend to start with a reference instrument like a title or certificate. But there's a whole lot of things going on between people that are not on that certificate, and there are a whole lot of media items that can record that. Here's something on data mining that we did in Ghana. These are the person-to-person networks. So these are people, these are the relationships between them. And it was a case study that was what I would call hot, not a huge lot of land grabbing and insecurity of title. If you go door to door, you'll find out these connections, but who are the gatekeepers and who are the power holders and how do they change over time? It's one technical response. So hybrid governance, and a lot of what I've heard is there's this rational state assumption where people follow the law, they respect the rule of law, but the reality is very different in most countries around the world. It's happened in Europe and other Western countries and countries in Asia, but it's taken centuries for that to happen. So if we go fragile states, the state has limited power, and in informal settlements even more. So if you recognize hybrid governance, okay, you can say that it's an essential component if you're dealing with an informal settlement, but you might strengthen unethical behavior and what happens when things fall apart. The other thing is the organizational culture. So title registries are machine-like, rules and procedure are of utmost performance, but that doesn't fit hybrid governance where things are in constant negotiation. You're dealing with, in informal settlements, a political culture. So people invade land as a way of, first of all, securing land, but it's also a political process, as is all planning. And then you've got NGOs and land restitution. There's an adhocracy culture. Situation is complex. You deal with whatever the problem is now on ad hoc. You deal with what is negotiated. And in that culture, managers tend to ignore rules, standards, and procedures. Hence, I'd set up a system, the next guy comes in, forgets about it, and the stuff gets put on a shelf. So that's what, I mean, in very simple terms, simplistic terms, that's what you're dealing with. So Monwabisi Park, let's get onto that. It's a informal settlement in Cape Town. It's an organized invasion started in 1997. People flooded into the city as the apartheid system loosened its ties in the 1980s, and then the 1990s with democracy, even more people moved in from rural areas. So you had 6,900 households, 25,000 people. The city of Cape Town provided taps because by constitutional law you have to, and communal toilets. You had a very high violent crime rate, as you do in a lot of these areas. So one NGO, Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading, became involved in 2009. This is the developed part of the area, Khayelitsha. It's more than 1 million people here. These are the various blocks in the GIS that is being created for Monwabisi Park. As I said, it's invaded land. I won't go into that. VPUU came in and said, if we develop, you will reduce the violent crime. So that's their primary philosophy. So the city of Cape Town was the landowner. You've got an intermediary who's the change agent, resource provider and facilitator. The first thing they did was develop a safe node area committee from all the different community organizations to drive their development process. SANCO is the South African National Civics Association that goes back to the anti-apartheid movement, where the civics were organized alternative systems of government. So your hybrid governance, one of your institutions is something like SANCO. They are aligned with the national ruling party, but they do a lot of micro-level governance at settlement level. And part of their development was they said you need community records because you need secured land tenure and you've got to have security of tenure. And then you had the police and things like Neighborhood Watch, which improved safety and security. So the VPU approach was citizen empowerment. Communities draw up their plans, experts are catalyzers, and volunteerism. If community members don't volunteer, then they withdraw. So they're provided with resources, ongoing leadership training, and looked at incremental in situ upgrading. And part of the process was you move no one, not a greenfield fields development. if you move people, then you create all sorts of political problems. But in Monmouth BC Park, that wasn't something that was workable. So you would do the in situ upgrade. So I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but there's a sequence of events. You create a community action plan. You go through a whole lot of negotiations. They got certificates of tenure issued by the City of Cape Town. And then electrification, which is a critical thing based on a block numbering system. The other thing was the City of Cape Town. One of the protocols, if you want to get development, you can't have people continually moving into the settlement, which is a major problem in informal settlement. People sell land rights, their family members put pressure on them. But the City of Cape Town enforced the no new shacks protocol. So the anti-land invasion. So you didn't have community leaders getting threatened or in some cases killed, or the community records office getting burnt down, which is what can happen when you've got, I don't know about Monmouth BC Park, but elsewhere I've seen that happen. So the problem with the incremental approach was the law and planning policy didn't accommodate it. And then city engineers in different departments, and I've worked in those, they move no one is impractical, and you don't want to perpetuate a slum. The guy over the road has a government house with a plot. These people will want the same, and I've seen that come up in other case studies. And the other thing is officials will say, how much power are you going to give to these community-based organizations and these hybrid government organizations? And also officials said, well, yeah, great. When VPUU leave, we still have to administer Monmouth BC Park and provide services. And the services were complicated in terms of the action plan. So that is the settlement in 2019 when I was last there. And electrification, you pay as you go. You put a meter inside a shack and you pay for your electricity as you go. And that's made major improvements. It also improves your tenure security, because if you're electrified, that means you're allowed to be there. And you can also see with tenure security, people were given tenure certificates, and I'll get into that in a minute. They're invest in that. So that's inside a tin shack. You put down a concrete floor, invest in furniture. This is us doing interviews. We were saying, you know, trying to work out the effectiveness of this information system, whether people were using it or not, or whether they'd look elsewhere. And in some cases, people had been in there, you know, investing in infrastructure, appliances and so forth. The critical thing here is, though, you've got to use a communal toilet. So 5 people have the toilet. And you've got to create stabilities to stop people vandalizing those. And people outside of that, who've moved in later, don't get access to that. They're keys that go to 5 shacks. And getting to the toilet at night can be a problem for women. So that was the first part of the community action plan, which was then put into a QGIS. They let the community say, okay, we're going to move no one, but how are we going to get the roads into this place if development happens? So and as you can see, servicing this would be a problem in terms of pipelines and so forth from an engineering aspect where they balked at it. But trying to get the existing pathways and trying to get people to move their shacks. So that was the first thing. Then you've got a block and a shack numbering system. So that gives you an identifier for the object. Okay, thank you. Then developed protocols by community structures, no new structures. And then the Community Records Office, which was critical part of this. So it was operated by Monmouth BC Park volunteers. You needed a simple system that community members can handle, and then negotiate protocols around tenure issues that would be handled by area committees and dispute resolution committees. So it would be any transaction had to be cleared by Sanko area committees. So far that has worked quite well, but of course they're aligned to a political party. And then the city would not update their certificates of residence. So the local community issues a letter of residence, and they get daily backup on sites. And then the system has also become a one-stop shop, the information system for taps and toilets, early childhood development, small business support, IT training, So you've got this administration system that is not just tenure related, but you can use it with people being paid a basic fee. Okay. So, as I said, you should expect this in an adhocracy. It doesn't adhere to standards. It must be easy to use, and you leave your complex tenure relationships to social processes. That's an example of the certificate. That's the database. It's just a list, and you can keep adding to that list. So it's an information system that is working. You have to work through committees, but it's contingent on the Safe Node Area Committee. So what VPU did was an enormous amount of training and organizational development of the people involved in these committees. And then you've got the ebb and flow of different personalities and hybrid governance arrangements. How much power do officials want to let these community-based organizations have? And from an official's perspective, who's the face of failure when things go wrong? Okay, and what also happened, there was significant frustration. There's participatory planning fatigue when people expected houses and development and it didn't happen because the law didn't allow it and officials were scared to commit. So the participatory planning approach, under certain conditions, suggests it can work, but it differs from, the VPU differs from other NGOs I've worked with in that they recognize the information system as a going concern, as a critical success factor. You had to keep this information system going. You couldn't just go in and leave and get the next guy. Now, it's a working system and it provides an alternative to registration, not that people on the ground saw that. Some of them definitely wanted a title because the guy over the road had one. Others said it was fine. The questions that we ask is one of these alternatives. What's the trajectory? Is it a project life cycle or is there something as a going concern that we can use as an example? So can we evolve the system to be accommodated by national or regional registry? And what are the organizational cultural shifts that have to be managed for this to succeed? Okay, so that's my, I will leave it on that note. I've dumped in a whole lot of different concepts and I don't offer a solution. I offer a whole lot of questions and how somebody in one case has dealt with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. And we wouldn't dare ask an academic to provide a solution.
Sorry, Rowan, I missed that. My sound just went
off. That was really good. I agree.
Thanks very much for that, Mike, because I think you really took us down to the ground level, and actually your case study really shows us, I think, a lot of the abstract things we talk about at that global level. Really, I think what you've shown there is some of the where we're trying to get those global frameworks, templates, and so on. I think we're really trying to replicate what gets done there at those local levels when they're successes. So in terms of your integrated approach and the information system being used for multiple purposes and not just a tenure security initiative, but it's sort of linked in with the whole fabric of the community. We have...
If I can just respond, I think it's critical, and planners have done this for the last 100 years, so you have to go down to community level before you pop out of the sky and offer people a solution, and do at least some testing of what are the social and political relationships as they occur there. I mean, I've done a Cook's tours of images of what we've looked at, and those things are still out there, you know. And here's one system that's worked. I'm not saying you can duplicate it necessarily, or there are critical conditions to duplicate it, and a lot of money that's gone into that. Yep.
Thanks very much, Mike. Is there any questions, Kwabena, from our chat environment or in the Q&A? I did notice there has been a question put there. It's quite a long question from an anonymous attendee. And if I might just read that out quickly, Well, Kwabena, perhaps you'd even like to read it out to play an active role in the session.
Yeah, the question is that the example of South Africa in adopting citizen-based land tenure security without adopting or referencing to any international framework on land administration suggested that it could work. How is this or not aligning to some international frameworks, which also put importance on community participation in land administration?
Well, I mean, people are saying community participation is necessary for a long time. I mean, it's the balance between what you can do at the micro level and what you can do at policy level, and what officials can do. I mean, officials have to follow regulations and procedures. So I'm not so sure whether, it wasn't, I think you've got to go back into the organizational culture. The particular case I'm looking at here says there's an adhocracy culture. If you look at 1980s definitions of organizational culture, they're not good. They didn't look at it, and I haven't seen them look at anything like frameworks when they're dealing with an immediate problem, where you're dealing with all sorts of conflict and social issues and people threatening to lock you up and not let you out of the settlement on a daily basis. That's what they deal with. So it would be a good idea to look at the international frameworks, but it's not what they do. And it's not, this is what South Africa is doing. This is what a particular NGO did in negotiation with planners at the city. But, it was a highly controversial project with people in the city saying, yes, we need innovation, but you've also got to discuss the practical sides of development with what is possible. And I worked in the city and dealt with this as a land surveyor. What can you do that is going to work? It's all very well to say we're going to move no one, when you've got a whole lot of bends in the pipes because you've let this grow organically. The guy who runs the sewerage system or the water reticulation has a budget and he has to maintain this thing, and he's going to say no. So it's not I'm not posing this as a solution. So I don't think I can answer your question. And I don't think the case study answers that particular question, how it fits into the framework. The way I see these international frameworks and things like the LADM and STDM and fit for purpose land administration, they provide guidelines which you can look at as for solutions in your strategic planning process, and you use what fits your local situation. And part of fitting your local situation is asking questions, working out how things are going to work, and how is what you're going to introduce they're going to work. Okay, so you can introduce titles, for instance. Let me just finish. But if people don't use them because the family won't allow you to transfer it, then you've defeated a whole lot of the rationale behind it. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Let's move then to the final presenter for the session, which is Dr. Kate Rukesi, who is currently based up in the lockdown-free city of Wollongong in Australia. So we've done the full circle around the globe, and we've arrived back in this time zone, well, at least for me it is. So Kate is and has been a driven and energetic leader with passion of translating policy into action, and she's done so for a long time. She's been with LEI, Land Equity International, for over 15 years, and is, for the last couple of years at least, she can correct me if I'm wrong, has been the managing director. And I know Kate from a long time back because we both studied at the University of Melbourne back last millennium. And she was a few years ahead of me. And I think she may have even been a lecturer of mine at some point, and may have given me a few bad grades, and I've never forgiven her for it. So Kate most recently was coordinating the MRLG, or the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, and also the FAO Regional Land Forum in Bangkok she managed recently also. And she was also key in some of the work that was mentioned earlier in this session around LGAF and some of the indicators around that. So Kate, it's great to have you here to present for us, and you're again going to give us another perspective on land administration in 2020, and this time really from an active and energetic SME. And I think you've even got some colleagues sitting in the session for us. So over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Rowan. And I think that my presentation here, I'm just going to try and quickly share my screen with you all. But it really does touch on all of the presentations that we've seen today. How are we going there? Is that sharing there? Good? Excellent. So yeah, thank you very much. I think that I should be able to cross over quite a few of the presentations. I don't think I'll go quite as deeply as Michael has, but let's see how we go. As a geometrician though, I really do like things to be quite linear and systematic, or have, nice recognizable patterns. The lovely drone and satellite images that we're so used to seeing. It gives you almost a calm feeling when you see such holistic views. However, I really think, and I think these presentations have shown us, that the current and future directions of the land sector, as broad as this may be taken, are non-linear pathways. They're better described through interconnected networks with options for tiered solutions that respond differently to communities, subnational governments and national governments, as well as solutions created via the private sector. COVID has certainly disrupted our patterns of movement and forced countries to focus on critical national responses. And this includes for housing, employment and trade. Asia and the Pacific, which was the opening for today's land sessions, is rather unlike the rest of the world. We did lock down our borders for the majority of the year. I think this is focusing us on a period of reflection at our national solutions. Hopefully it's growing our national priorities and building national resilience. The question is that, will this stem more appetite for homegrown solutions, or is it pushing vulnerable populations to the brink? I really think we need to get flexible. As a business, LEI has been quite flexible, and it's been essential in both terms of operating during COVID, but also as professionals consulting in the land sector for the past 2 decades. We've been engaging in changing the discourse on improving tenure security across landscapes, with far more flexible and context-specific options becoming available to us. The conversations on land tenure are richer. Some government and commercial policies are becoming more responsive, and certainly technology and products are giving us more flexible and accessible options and solutions. A key layer of this discourse is also awareness of social and environmental dimensions to our work. So when I was asked to give an opinion on the state of play, I kind of went into a bit of mind mapping mode to reiterate key areas of attention that we feel matter in conversations when considering the land sector. I will attempt to draw some parallels of our working examples to share what we consider key strategies relevant to urban-rural integration discourse in the context specifically of community resilience. The Mekong Region Land Governance Project, which is implemented by Land Equity International and our partner GRET. And I was fortunate to be the team leader on this project for about 4 years. It's working to improve land tenure security for smallholder farmers through improvements in policy and practice, and has been doing so for the past 6 years. The project doesn't address land administration systems and functions through the typical land reform style project. It's instead an opportunity that has been gradually fostering engagement across civil society, academia and the private sector, and not the least government, for making changes to business as usual for land tenure security, particularly in a rural setting. Now, working through the continuum for tenure security is as essential today as it was when the discourse started back with Lisa Ting's work in the late 90s. That was when the idea started crystallizing. And I think Keith also touched on that, back in his presentation. The SDGs and VGGTs have developed much needed attention towards the recognition of customary tenure. By increasing awareness on this, we so too have generated a space for numerous options to recognise, document and register tenure rights in new systems. And this is what Michael's just touched on as well. It's the ability to provide better protection of individuals, families and communities that are not necessarily covered by the strictly formal systems of title and deed registration. But more important to this is that purely the documentation is giving a voice and empowerment of populations living in vulnerable and insecure tenure environments. It's critical, and it's this community resilience that's inherently linked to ensuring customs are also reinforced and recognised. Across the different platforms that many land practitioners are involved in, there's also the momentum for improving scenarios with respect to community rights and recognition of resources in the face of government and private investor engagement in investments. This may be across forest lands, degraded forests and agricultural landscapes. In the best practice scenarios, this has been moving better and moving forwards with engagement, but it really does still only occur in a minority of cases. And there's a long way to go before agricultural investments being responsible are actually the norm. I'd like to share an example from the Mekong project, and it's a little bit similar to Michael's presentation, where this is really a very small scale kind of sample of the work, but it does show the need to amplify local resilience and local solutions, and how that a review and a reflection on national policies is absolutely necessary if we want to actually build in community resilience. A virgin forest in northeastern Laos, it has high quality soil, it's very remote, it's mountainous, and it's full of large old growth trees. The land, however, is only accessible via the Mekong River and roads coming from the south from China, as well as some minor roads going up from the capital of Vientiane in Laos. The rural areas are populated by mostly ethnic communities, and small urban settings have some paved roads that mark out the local district towns. The land around is rapidly being converted from landscape of subsistence agriculture and forests that provided both labour and food security for generations. It's been converted to monocrops, landscapes of short-term cash crops, short-term employment, health issues from toxic fertilisers and contract farming, rather than land ownership. The district officials in these conversions reap short-term cash injections, while the populations trying to live there are left with a relatively bleak future. Community resilience looks like a small village, and the image portrayed here. This lady is living in a small village cluster as part of a group of villagers that came together to fight against further investment in their district. The MRLG project, with some technical support, helped to assist and document their claim to a sacred forest site, and also to further establish tea exporting business and small tea smallholder farmers or own personal plots. It was a collective documentation of the people's long established rights to access virgin tea trees, and also that harvesting their tea varieties on the household plots, as well as the establishment and the justification of their tea processing factory and the processing and packaging facility for export. That was the only way they could convince the district to retain their rights to the village land, as opposed to reselling and passing over a concession area to Chinese investors. The community was supported by local NGOs and had international tea experts come to assist, as well as financing and support from the MRG project. All of this just to formalise their existing and sustainable relationship with land against the threat of becoming landless contract workers to Chinese businesses. This would have caused a distinct loss in the diversity and cultural identity, and it was real strong community resilience that took effort and resources. And it's the need for a national prioritisation to actually reflect on what they consider is best for their future, as opposed to only the economic gains. It was a very difficult scenario for this group of people, and it's only being short-lived when the national priorities are not to invest in their own people. So this is a bit of a rural example, and I think that under COVID conditions, there has been a rush to return to rural areas. But if we look over a longer time frame, the reverse of global trends since the turn of the century has been quite the opposite. Prior to March this year, it was estimated that globally we were on track for having 2/3 of households living in urban areas by 2050. In the context of the Pacific Islands, combining urban migration with climate change issues of rising sea levels and increasing occurrence of natural disasters, it's a fairly serious problem that we're dealing with. A rural to urban migration is not just a transfer of people. It must accommodate infrastructure growth, skills, services, expanding industries, labour, and of course, housing. A significant problem to the Pacific, and not unique to the Pacific, is growing urban informal settlements in very precarious and poorly unserviced areas. The migration's been happening for decades, yet there's a complete lack of progress in expanding city limits, changing zoning regulations, or projecting for the future of cities. Restricting planning laws increase issues of informality, disputes, and emphasise disparity and inequality. 35% of Pacific Islanders in a region with a population of 10 million now live in towns and cities. In Vanuatu, 25% of the national population are urban residents, and it's predicted to climb to as steeply as 38% by 2030. It's really just around the corner. With this rise in populations comes a growing rate of informal settlements and poverty. There's a need for advocacy and pressure from Pacific nations to request support from the $2 billion pledge by the Australian government, as well as others, to address core issues of planning and infrastructure, water and sanitation, housing, and tenure security. The focus should be on vulnerable low-income and migrant populations to reduce future poverty, improve their health, and improve social inequalities. Consideration should also be given to those with little to no representation in council planning, infrastructure investments, and the decision makers. The city limits are decades behind real growth. Restrictions on plot sizes which occur under planning laws, this is largely based on colonial era, are similarly as far from realistic, and they only serve to really create illegality and elitism. To reiterate a recent Economist article, it's a colonial era planning law legacy, and the technical matters are still being played out in politics. We really do need to break this down. The last sort of theme I wanted to touch on, and particularly since we heard about FELA, was the area of tools and technology. Access to imagery is cheaper, reliable, and far more up to date. We're able to use mobile devices for data capture, and it doesn't require a PhD to understand and manipulate. The ability to put mapping and spatial data capture immediately in the hands of more people to make decisions is incredibly empowering. In addition to technology for solutions, we're seeing more and more of this analytical and process-driven tools, guidelines, and frameworks to help us do our work across the various disciplines and fields of land administration. LEI have played a part in some of this, developing LGAF and COFLAS, and also the public-private partnerships in land administration and analytical operational frameworks. And today we've heard just about the FELA. But yes, it does need people to delve into these tools and understand critically what the limitations are and how to ensure the best use of the tools and the information that the tools are supposed to bring about. Using those tools and the frameworks needs deep questioning into the results. And if the results are going to be used by the owners of those results and the governments that will use it need to be fully engaged during the establishment of that. Engagement and ownership of the results will only then relate and be used in the future for planning. But that means that the data that is needed needs to come from the governments in which we're trying to help develop strategies for. It needs a willingness to acknowledge the current situation, to reflect, and to plan for the change. And I think that there's often a large gap between the reporting and the real changes that will be made. And that's why if there is ownership of the data and of the data that's used in those tools, then you're likely to see far more change. I think, the challenges also which hamper progress towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goal targets are complex. The systems are complex, relationships, politics, financing are all among other issues to resolve. And untangling the crux of the issues requires very deep thinking and engagement. It's not just the checklists and questions, that's only the start of the analysis and the engagement. For lasting and effective results, empowering counterparts, exchanging in debate and co-identifying adaptive solutions is where real progress and reform is most likely to come from. I sort of think that the future in the land sector, even more so post-COVID, is to strengthen solutions that are homegrown, or at least co-designed with counterparts who will be directly implementing, and truly acknowledge time and capacity constraints in these designs. In many countries, informality and land tenure insecurity can be a result of outdated planning, outdated land policies and land laws, and therefore engaging the discussion with surveyors and land professionals is essential. Today, the conversation may start with the idea of alleviating poverty. It may start with the need to address effects of climate change and natural disasters. Keith mentioned the resilience theme of the World Bank. It may also start due to social unrest and disputes, and that was touched on by Michael. In all these scenarios, land administration professionals have a part to play in improving the lives and having a voice and putting solutions forward in different sectors where opportunities lie and we can make a difference. So thanks very much, Rowan. I'll leave it back with you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ricochet, for rounding out our speaker moments. And we're obviously getting towards the top of the hour. So I'm just going to change up a little bit how we plan to do this last part. Initially, we did plan to have a more extensive panel session, but due to the interesting nature of the talks and the fact that there's always a bit of overhead, we've kind of gone longer on the Q&A at the end of each talk. I noticed in the Q&A box there isn't, there's one new question that's just come through, and maybe we'll throw that just to Kate, and then I just want to give the opportunity for all the speakers to have a final statement, and then we'll round out the session. Kate, the question that I think is picking up on the point you were making about COVID is, I wonder if the situation and loss of employment has in one way encouraged migration to rural areas and the increased utilisation of agricultural resources. I think you more or less indicated that, but do you think that's going to be a longer term trend?
I can't comment based on any fact, but just knowing that with the transition of subsistence farming to cash crops and things like that, it places a much more dire need for food security and a revision of national policies on food security rather than on economic priorities. And they've started to talk about food sovereignty, which is looking at a nation's ability to produce its own food. So yes, while populations have gone back to their rural settings, whether or not they're able to put as much food on the table for a recently grown household is questionable. Remembering that those people that weren't living in the rural areas were often providing funds back to their households back in the rural settings. So I think it would depend largely on people's economic disposition as to whether or not that trend will occur. I think in Australia, where people have decided that lockdowns are extremely cruel and they need more space, then yes, there's a transition back out to rural areas, but it's certainly not going to be the case as a global trend in my view.
Great, thanks, Kate. So we've got 5 minutes left with our excellent panelists, and I really appreciate that some of them, it's getting really late into the night now. So I'm just going to very quickly put up sort of a way to sort of capstone or sort of round it or bookend our conversation here this morning. And I'd just like each of our panelists, in case, and Ava, you can both have a go too, because we do have 5 speakers, to either use your last minute to sort of summarize and recap your most important points, or you can go off and answer these 3 questions here. We've seen a range of different perspectives from the different sectors, but also different parts of the planet, and giving us different views on this whole land administration discourse and set of activities that go alongside that. And my question to you is open and broad, because we've got such, have we got the land administration mix right in terms of the global discourse and the role of FIG? We've seen from the UN-GGIM side the creation of this FELA framework, but we've also seen some great examples from Mike and Kate of the bottom-up activities from happening. If you remember back to Keith, he's also given us this view of, well, where's the bank sitting in all this and what's its trajectory been, but also some hints at some significant changes that might be happening in terms of funding and projects and the nature of projects into the future. So that's the first question. The second is, do you think, from your sector or from your organisation, is most important going forward to change or get right? Is it a business as usual for the land administration sector, or do we really need to see some radical changes? And the last question I'll pose to you is, does the COVID-19 pandemic represent just a speed hump or a roadblock for the short term, or is it really a game changer for the next 5-10 years? You can choose to answer those questions, or you can just give your own last minute summary. I'll leave it to you, and we will. I think it's fair if we go in reverse order this time. Is that so? So Kate, you get to kick off, unless you wish to hand on.
I was actually trying to reply to one of the Q&A questions, but I think I touched on the COVID-19 change in our direction. Is it urban versus rural? And I think, based on the fact that there'd been a huge transition, it's been over many, many decades, this migration to urban areas. I don't think we're going to see a major disruption in that in terms of developing countries. There will always be a need for rural areas to be maintained in terms of providing for agriculture. And our trend in the Mekong Regional Land Governance Project is really to support that and to support smallholders. But urban areas are attracting people for education and employment, and that will continue to grow. I think COVID is just a slight disruption.
Okay, thanks, Kate. And then we'll go to Prof. Barry for a closing remark. Oh, speaker, I'll just unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. I'll deal with question 1. I think we've got the land admin mix right as far as possible. Those are, as I said, those are guiding tools. And work with those tools if you can, if they suit. So if we're talking about design, well, you go from describe, explain, predict, explain and predict, and then design. That would be the linear process, but it's systemic. You do them all at the same time, and you've got to balance things. So I was asked why, in one of the questions, why are you anti-standards? I'm not at all. But what I've described was a case study with the organizational culture, which people are not going to stick to it. The other thing that is missing here is how do you deal with hybrid governance? There's a whole lot that's done on the security establishment of hybrid governance, but very little on land. And at last, you can't just go from informal settlement to title settlement. The hybrid governance lasts. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Fantastic, Michael. Thanks very much. Switching back to Case and Ava, if they're still with us.
I'm still awake. Don't worry. I'm still there. Maybe as question 1 and 3 were already tackled a little bit, I'll go into question 2 maybe. So at least all the questions had some attention. I think one of the most important things going forward, and also listening to all the different presentations I heard this evening, the question that comes up with me all the time is the scalability. I think in land administration, we talk about a huge issue. It's many people, many parcels, everything is a lot. And we have very good examples in the world of things that's happening, but we need some kind of approach for scalability. If we can apply something maybe on a small village, can we apply it in a full country, or how do we make things scalable? And I still see that as one of the challenges for the coming period, to make things scalable, that the things that we apply on a small scale, how can we do that on a larger scale? And it's from practice, I can say it's a difficult part, because you can develop a system for a small area, but how does that apply for a bigger area? So I think in all ways, the scalability in time and in space, for me, is a question, if you ask about the second question in your presentation, that should have really our attention if we're going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Case. Ava?
Yeah, so I would just like to answer a little bit, or not answer, or give a statement to first question and the third question. I think the land admin mix is definitely right, and we need to have these initiatives, and we need to have this data from the bottom-up approaches, and we need those guidelines at the top down in order to get this alignment between the national agencies and really this bottom-up approaches. So we need to have the mix, and we need to balance it out with those guidelines and frameworks. And I think this is exactly where I do see FELA or any kind of standardization processes as well. And the UN and SDGs, they just give us this overall goal. And I mean, it's 2020, it's 2030. It's not long away anymore. And I think, seeing also with this pandemic, there is, like, just from the Netherlands, for example, but also from Austria, there's an increase in land transactions, and there will be an increase in land transaction, and there is more demand for digital data also in the developing world, and there is more demand for services and like cloud systems. So I mean, we are on the go, and I think we basically probably even need to speed more up and really need these lessons learned, like micro sharing and also like Kate was sharing, in order to get this right, and in order to make this speed up.
Thanks, Ava. And Keith, the final section.
Thanks, Ron. Going through the questions. On the first one, on the SDGs, if this was a World Bank project, we'd be restructuring to get the results framework right. That's certainly been the call of people like Philip Aston, the immediate outgoing special rapporteur. If you read the 2020 report on the SDGs, it says there's lots of problems. It says things are wrong, but the solution is collect more data. And I assume it's from UN-GGIM, add more spatial. I think that's wrong. I think the tools and stuff, I think Mike and others put it quite well. I think the tools are good in terms of having principles and things to refer to. I think anyone who tries to follow any of the tools religiously, it's burdensome. And I think IGIF has already proven that if you look at the work in Guyana. But it's good to have the tools around as principles and things like that. What's important going forward? Well, I don't think anyone could say it's business as usual. I don't know whether there'll be radical changes. The reality is we just don't know. There's so much hype at the moment about what needs to happen and what will be happening. No one really knows. It's going to evolve over time. Does COVID change our direction, urban versus rural? I actually don't think so, because most people are still going to live in urban areas, and that's the way it's going to be. And I think what's going to be important is greater consideration of healthy, safe spatial planning in our urban areas, and that tends to have been ignored on the land administration side. Thanks very much.
Thank you then all to our panelists. We're actually just a little bit over time now, but I'd just like to everyone who is still online with us. Thank you for joining, all the session participants. Sorry that our session in interactive Q&A was a bit curtailed there at the end, but as you can see, you do have the opportunity in all these sessions to be posting questions along the way. So thanks to Crit, Cynthia, and the others who were doing that. I'd just like to give a little round of applause for those who presented this morning, this evening, and this night. It was a really nice session to be part of. And I really do have to thank you again for getting up or getting down at all the different times that you did. Just a little plug for the sessions coming up later today. The EU opening is happening later today, Asia Pacific time, obviously in the morning for the Europeans. And there's also the education session that's on at around the same time, I think. Some other great sessions during the week, looking at some of the things we haven't unpacked in this sessions around some of the technological developments happening. So check the program and get along to as many sessions as you can. As you can see, the more people we have involved and the more richer the discussions are. Daniel, with that, I'd just like to again thank Kwabena for acting as rapporteur. And Daniel, with that, I'm going to hand back to you if there's any other housekeeping. Otherwise, I think we can close the session.
Thank you, Rohan. Great work, everyone. I'll see you in another session during the week. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all, and enjoy your evenings, mornings, afternoons.
Bye.